And I'm very pleased to introduce Kirsten Martin. Kirsten is a professor in the business school at George Washington University, where she teaches strategic management and public policy. And she's been doing some terrific work on privacy for quite a while, and so we're happy to congratulate you on your paper being selected for tonight. I'm Mary Culnan. I'm the vice chair of the board at the Future Privacy Forum, and I'm also a former academic, retired. So Kirsten's paper, which she wrote with Helen Nissenbaum. Helen is not here tonight, but she's a professor at NYU, New York University, and is, many of you know, has done some pioneering work related to contextual use of information, meaning when personal information is used out of context, privacy problems emerge because it's the old secondary use problem. And so this paper is looking at context, and in terms of public record information, I think Kirsten will tell a little bit more about that in a minute. And it's an empirical study, which makes it different from the other papers where they went out and collected a lot of data and analyzed it, so they actually have some findings that they can use to bring to bear on the problem they're discussing. Okay, so first of all, what motivated you and Helen to write this paper? Public records haven't exactly been a hot topic in the privacy literature, but they really raise a lot of important privacy issues because the data's public and basically you can do anything you want with it. So,
well, and that's a good segue. So I would say in general, both Helen and I individually and now together in a couple papers, we're trying to look at where we seemingly see simple binary labels. So where you might see something as being information is either sensitive and protected or not sensitive, and you can do whatever you want, or you're in a public area or you're in a private situation. And so the public and private was the area that we were looking at here, and we're trying to focus on, and Helen had written extensively about it. She would refer to the incorrect notion of being in public is where, quote, anything goes. And I had been talking about where information always has a terms of use, that there's a constant term, that it's never, that there are no privacy expectations. They might be different, but we always have to look and ask, what are those privacy expectations? So that's how we came together to try to do an empirical piece to try to understand, in something that's referred to as public, what are the privacy expectations, what's the appropriate use, and who should have access to that information based on consumers. And when we started tackling it, it was just too large. And so what we found was that we had to split it between public records information, which was becoming more and more with open data initiatives, slippery. So it was less hard to get at the information. It was more accessible to people and easy to move around. And then look separately at the public space problem, meaning what are your privacy expectations in public space? Because combining them, it just became too confusing. So that's how we rested on the public records question and trying to look at very varied public records and trying to combine them and understand under what conditions do people ever find it appropriate to access public records? And does it matter who is giving you the information from public records? If you go to the government source itself, if you get it from the person, or if you get it from a data broker. So that was the general impetus behind the study, was trying to understand the contextual norms around public records information.
from the consumer's point of view.
Oh, sorry, from the consumer's point of view.
Because from the government's point of view and the
Right.
people in business and others that use it, it's anything goes. Okay, so one of the things that's been very interesting about a lot of the research you've been doing is the methodology that you use to collect your data. I mean, people I think are familiar with surveys, and you're not doing surveys.
Normal surveys.
So talk a little bit about, or a lot about, how you collect your data and the methodology you use, and sort of where the people that provide the data come from.
Sure. So, so for both Helen and I separately, and then together, we would say that you can't just look at one piece of the context and try to make a generalization off of it. You can't just look at where you are or who has access to it or what the type of information is. You need to take into consideration kind of what information is being given to who and for what purpose in what context. So that's already, I just listed 4 different moving parts that you'd have to take into consideration. And so in a typical survey, they might just ask you a question such as, is it appropriate to access your marital records? And you might say, well, it depends on who and for what purpose. And so what we use here is what's called a factorial vignette, which just means the person reads a short paragraph that I systematically change, say, 3 of the moving parts. And in this situation, it was, what record was it? A property record, a voter record, marriage record, or criminal record. I tried to make it as varied as possible. Where did they get the information? Did they just ask you, are you married or not? Did they get it from an online government records where you could actually go online and find it out? Or did they get it from a data broker? And then in what context are they asking to use the data? Is it for an employment purpose? Is it to give you a loan? Is it a social host at a house? And I could change each of those, and then all the person would be asked was, I think for this survey, it was, do you find this okay? It was almost a sliding scale. And what that allowed you later on, one, the person has to take into account all those moving parts at the same time, so that's much more realistic as to a real life situation, since we're usually not just asked one piece of it, we ask who's using it and for what purpose. But then it also allows there to be a sliding scale where what I find out later is what moving part in that little story that I just gave them is only like 3 sentences long, what moving part annoyed them the most? What made them say that's not okay? And in this situation, even with all those different moving parts, the one that really moved the dial to say that is not okay was data brokers having access to it. That was the one that just, every single time, no matter what context, no matter what piece of information, they might say it's okay for you to gain access to it from the government, but if it went, the very same information had been scraped and put into a data broker, they immediately said by like 60 points, it wasn't even close, they would sling the arrow down and they'd say, no, that's not okay. Which was an interesting finding to us and for data brokers, I was at PLSC, the Privacy Law Scholars Conference, and people from the data broker industry came up and said, why do they not like us so much? And I said, I don't know. So I felt it was a little personal at that point. I was like, I don't know.
So who were the people that read your vignettes and expressed their opinions? Yeah.
So we've done all different types of people. We've had students take it. They're not extremely, in my own experience, they're good at telling what students think about it, but it's not really generalizable to the general population. 18 to 22-year-olds are their own animal. If you have one, then you know what I'm talking about. So I've also done it with using a national sample, and then this one was using MTurk, which is on Amazon. It's just a mechanical Turk. It's a way that academics can have a place where we post surveys, and then you pay someone to take your survey. I usually pay about $2, but it varies. It completely varies. And this was only US and only adults.
So anybody out there, have you been a mechanical Turker? Or no? Anybody can do it, so.
Oh, yeah. If you want to make $2, I'll give you a survey.
Yeah, okay. Any of your other findings you'd like to tell people about?
You know, the other one one is that I would say that the respondents are extremely nuanced in their privacy judgments. When you look at different combinations of, was this record okay for a social host to have information, such as let's just use marital records. People would say that was fine for a host to know about a party goer, but not in an employment context. Like they were that specific about the type of information, where it was being received from, and why it was going to be used. And I think we sometimes don't give people enough credit as to how nuanced they really are. They're not just, they don't just give away their data to do whatever you want. They're pretty specific about it if you ask them. If you ask them kind of the more nuanced. The other is surprising, and that's consistent across all the studies that we've done. They're hardly ever kind of blanket, I just always love it when you use my data, or I always hate it. They're pretty nuanced about it. The other interesting finding that goes against some kind of general ideas is that the younger respondents were actually under 35 were more upset about the accessing through a data broker. Now that could be because they understood what a data broker was more, or that they're less trustful of business. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why. But the idea that younger respondents are actually less okay with the sharing of information, and I've actually found this in other situations as well, goes against the common wisdom that young people don't care. And which is what I would usually say to that is they might have different expectations of privacy, but it doesn't mean that they're less. So they might it might be that we just need to ask them, and they actually might be harsher judges of the use of privacy in other areas.
I think one thing that's very interesting is the idea that you found that people are so nuanced. And I mean, back in the days when there were phone books and there were some discussions about public record information, I always used to say, if people don't care about the information, if it's public and it should be available for any use by anybody, why doesn't everybody list themselves in the phone book in exactly the same way? Some people don't list themselves at all. Some people don't list their name. They list their initials. They don't put their address. That suggests even for name and address, phone number, which is a very sort of common set of public information. Basically, people have different preferences for different reasons. Okay, let's have one last thing. What do you hope that policymakers are going to take away from the study you and Helen did?
So, other than the findings about nuanced and young, and the idea that all information has a term of use, we just need to be specific about it. I would say that that just because something is labeled as a public record, that especially at the local level, we need to be really conscious about how easy it is for other parties to access it and for what purpose. It depends on the state, and so when we were just even looking at accessing voting records, some states make you jump through an extra hoop to get access to someone's party affiliation, and other states that's easier to access. And even that small little hoop makes it, in the term of friends of ours, more obscure, harder to get at. And that is helpful for people, just to have some level of protection to make the information slightly less slippery. And it's a mistake to think that just because something was collected by the government and then put out as, quote, public record, that there isn't an expectation that it might not be used for certain purposes, especially when we hear the information that Alessandro talked about with information being used for employment purposes, and some of the findings that we found here when we put it in the employment context or financial giving credit. It's problematic because they're going around laws of not asking you directly, but finding out your marital status somewhere else. And they could find out through public records.
Are there any questions from the audience for Kirsten? Yes. You want to repeat the question?
Sure. So the question was there any correlation between how sensitive the information might be, say your criminal record or something like that, with how easy or hard it is for people to actually get access to it? So we did not look at how easy it was to access in reality. What we actually looked at, we did ask them just a completely separate question, was how easy do you think this is to access? Which is a different question, because it could actually, and what we found was that they thought that voting records were almost impossible to access, which is not correct. And so we were trying to get just their perception of, and not just assume that they think that they know how easy everything is. We just asked them their perception. So we did not look at, like, in actuality, what are states doing for making something more obscure or harder to get access to.
So, are there any other questions? Yes.
So I think that is a really interesting question, and that is actually, it's a great tee up for that's our next study, is we're looking at public spaces when you willingly go into what we normally think of as public sphere, or such as posting something online, going to a political rally in a public area, shopping in a public area. You know, things that we think of, well, we all in this room, probably because we're all here, realize that that is actually being recorded, but a lot of people don't realize that. So that is our next, the idea was when it's not mandated that we give it, like, which it is when it's the government giving a public record, we have to register our house. So we register that we own it. So that's our next, that's what we're doing for the PLSC of 2017. So.
Time for one more question. Are there any other questions? Okay, great. Oh, sorry, didn't see you. I'm blinded by the light. Want to repeat the question?
So the question was, are there any efforts to push on firms and corporations to make their privacy policies less fluffy, more transparent and easier to access for people who want to know? So I would say Lori Craner, who's at Carnegie Mellon, she's a colleague.
Sitting right there. Yeah.
Oh, hey, I didn't even know that. That's not a plan. So now I better actually say what she does very well, since she would call me out on it if I don't say it correctly. So she does some work on private. I'm thinking about the work on labels. She's also done a ton of work on making it more accessible, and also how inaccessible it is, how hard it is to find the privacy policy, how unreadable they are. There's also, but that just is some of that work only reaffirms your point that they're hard to find, really hard to read. People, if we read them, it would take forever. and all those types of things. I think it's interesting that because of mobile, there is a push to make the key information more accessible because the screen is so small. So there's been this need, which and I'm not in this area, but I would think would actually push people to just generally have to make it more concise, to have the notice be more appropriate and notify you exactly what you want. I will say to your point that I did a study that showed that people just project their privacy expectations on the notice. So if you show them a very general notice that is, I used one from Fandango because a privacy notice person told me that was the worst policy in the world. And so I used it and just word replaced on Fandango. And when I asked them what was in it, they put all of their, in a separate study, what I had found were their privacy expectations, they just projected it onto the privacy notice. So sometimes when we check the box, we just assume the firm is actually doing what we want them to do. So I would say in the research area, there is, almost everyone has moved off the idea that the notice is actually substantive and giving us any information. No one that does the research on it believes that. Everyone agrees with you. So I would say there is a move towards that area.
Okay, terrific. Please join me in thanking Kirsten.